share the results. Sorry, I meant to share the results. I think you can scroll through it so you can look for yourself. I apologize. We're really fortunate to have Nonviolent Peaceforce's Executive Director, Tiffany Easthom, here to moderate today and to serve as facilitator of the conversation. She's going to pose the questions to Mel Duncan, who is co-founder and Director of Advocacy and Outreach for Nonviolent Peaceforce. Rosemary Kabaki, who is our head of mission for Myanmar, but is on loan to the United States to help do an assessment about work in the United States and also in the Twin Cities and then also broader around the country. And then Jessica Scully, who is also here working on the assessment. She has served in both Iraq and South Sudan as a security advisor for Nonviolent Peaceforce. I think we're in for a really interesting conversation and really look forward to you participating through the chat box. So we're going to start with the questions and answers. We will have about 15 minutes at the end where we'll be taking your questions. And then we will also be having a very a short presentation by a volunteer who will be also asking for your support. So I'm going to turn it over now to Tiffany Easthom.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back again for those of you who are returned, and welcome if you're new to our group for, as Marna said, our 7th Nonviolence Cafe. As always, it's great to see so many people tuning in to these conversations. It really tells, it's inspirational to all of us to be able to share this space, and it really tells us we've all got a lot on our mind these days, really around issues related to conflict and how that sparks violence and what are some alternatives. So as heavy as things have been, there is always opportunity for change and for development in better ways. So hopefully this conversation will help continue to share what we're working on and lead us all down that path together. So just to kick us off, I just wanted to talk for a few minutes about how actually for quite some time we've been thinking about programming in the US. And it's quite a bit beyond just we have lots of supporters in the US, our founders, many of our founders are from the US, and so that makes sense, but also because we have been watching for some time some really concerning indicators, sort of signs that there could be breakdown of relationships and more like really concretely escalations of violence, certainly in small scale pockets, and more, as everybody knows more recently, excuse me, potentially in larger scale. The work NP does, I mean, we work in violent conflict, so we do a lot of analysis. We're trained in conflict analysis, we're trained to look for these things. And we're all really oriented to think about developing countries, what are known as fragile countries, fragile contexts, as the place where we should be paying attention to these indicators and these concerns. And we're pretty practiced at thinking the industrialized world or the global north is something we don't need to worry about. There's systems in place, there's the rule of law, these kind of things. It just could never possibly happen there. But I mean, and given the percentage of people from the US on this call, I mean, as you well know, when you put all together what we've been seeing in recent years, years that do predate the current president, but some really clear indicators like the widespread use of weapons in civilian hands. And the proliferation of weapons, and in this case, well beyond self-defense handguns, but automated weapons, military-grade weapons, the formation of self-identified non-state armed actor groups. So for many years, have had groups in the US identifying as militia. They're self-identifying as malicious. So a sub-state structure of people who are indicating that they are going to take certain things into their own hands. It is an indication that they either do not trust the state to be able to provide, to meet their responsibility as duty bearers for community safety and security, or they disagree with the way things are happening, or they disagree with the agenda. And that's been picking up speed, I guess, as we all know. We've also been seeing the dismantling of certain institutions. And, you know, one thing that's always been really impressive with the US is really strong institutions, the separation of the different branches of government to be able to protect from individuals and to protect from weaknesses in some areas that can be held up in other areas. And of course, we've seen a lot of dismantling of those services, privatizing, corporatizing of things like disaster responses. All of that are worrying. And then the real deep entrenchment around identity politics or identity grouping, where people are turning into smaller and smaller groups of commonality, whether it's based on ethnicity, race, color, religion, whatever that is. And that's a very common indicator that there's a high risk for widespread outbreaks of violence. So these are some of the concerns that all of those things are in place right now. And then of course you have the pressure of an election and all the issues related to the misuse of state violence, the racism that's really manifested, and of course we add in that the pressure of the global pandemic. So this all to set the stage to say that it would be we would very comfortably, if it was another place, if it was a place like South Sudan, where I spent a lot of time and we were describing it that way, we would say, well, yeah, that's a country that's really on the precipice of some pretty big problems. And it's hard for us to imagine that that is true in a place as developed and with as big of an economy as the US. So that's what we're here for, and sort of really thought if there was ever a moment to really investigate and think about how NP could be a contributor to trying to help prevent violence and try and help to look at alternatives. This is a really important moment to do that. As always, our caveat with everything that we do is these are very complex problems. There's no singular solution to anything. So as great as I think our work is and the approach that we take, it's also just a contribution. It can only be a contribution. We need complex approaches and multi-directional approaches to complex problems. So that's a bit to set the stage where we are right now. And I will hold it there and turn it over to someone beloved and known to most of you. Many of you are one of our co-founders, Mel Duncan, who's gonna set the stage for us in much more detail about what's happening in the US and sort of frame what our approaches are in terms of the work that we're doing. So Mel, I turn it over to you. I think we just need to unmute him. Oh, we had a moment. Still struggling with the unmute.
Okay, I'm not sure.
Okay, here we are.
There we are.
Well, hello everyone. It's good to see so many old friends who have been with us now for decades, but also to note that there's 30% of us who are new. And that is always the most hopeful thing for me in a very bleak time. As I was reflecting on what I was going to say this morning, I was reviewing some of the newspapers and going through just today's headlines. Trump's new foe, the election, extremists see license to act from president. Going on, COVID reports up, burned by riots. And then just down at the very bottom is a little box that says Greenland ice sheet loses mass at fastest rate in 12,000 years. That's almost an afterthought at this moment. So I find today reading the newspaper really is a time for grieving and lament for me. And then going from there to prayer and meditation, and then committing to what it is I can do today. Terry Tempest Williams wrote recently in an obituary for The Land that we are at a breaking point as a species. That at that breaking point, we can either shatter and be destroyed, or we can open and bloom. Those options at that breaking point are here. Tiffany went through the indicators that we've been seeing. We have trigger points coming up in the next couple of months that reinforce what those indicators are. Trigger points like continued adverse court rulings, as we saw last week in the Breonna Taylor case. Trigger points in terms of continued police brutality. Trigger points leading up to, during, and after the election. I think the chances of us seeing violence in our communities across the United States are higher than any time since the beginning of the Great Depression. Now, with those trigger points also comes opportunities. And there are really three types of strategic nonviolence that are applied, and you can see here on the slide. And it's important to know the difference, but I want to emphasize that we need the application of all three of these approaches. The first one is using active strategic nonviolence to change the status quo, or what we call civil resistance or direct action. And there is a lot of organizing going on and training. I will put some resources in the chat box when I'm done speaking. And that will be necessary. We've seen examples of that right now, for example, being led by Black Lives Matter. There's a second form of the application of strategic nonviolence, and that's to protect the status quo, to use nonviolence for civilian-based civil defense. And that's really what the Standing Rock Sioux tribe were doing in 2016 and 2017. They were not there to protest or do civil resistance. They were protecting their land from incursion. And then the third application of strategic nonviolence that we'll focus on today is unarmed civilian protection, using strategic, disciplined nonviolence to protect civilians and to prevent violence. So it's important that we understand the difference between these applications, but also recognize that we're going to need all three of them, and we're going to need to cooperate better than we ever have. Right now, what we're doing in the United States, Tiffany mentioned Rosemary and Jessica and Marna and others are doing an assessment. We're actually doing an experiment. We're looking at, have the lessons that we've learned in places like Sri Lanka, South Sudan, Iraq, Myanmar, are any of those lessons that we've learned applicable to the context in Minneapolis and in the greater US? And we found some interesting entry points, and Jessica and Rosemary will be getting into the specifics of these in a few minutes. But we found that the Service Employees International Union is interested in working with us, and not only to do training, but to see that these unarmed approaches get put into the state certification for private security guards, so that these civilian approaches are required to be licensed. We also are working with a neighborhood patrol in the middle of the Black community, who will be starting to patrol their neighborhoods in anticipation for the coming elections and want to go through the training on unarmed civilian protection. Most, I think excitedly, Jessica and Rosemary and Amira and I have been working with a gang diversion organization, working on nonviolent approaches with young men between 16 and 21 who are looking at how they might do unarmed civilian protection in their community. We also, in the week after next, will be providing training for the Minneapolis Public Schools, as they have created, they have decided to no longer have police in the schools, but security specialists. And so we will be helping to train them the week after next. And then, of course, organizing and supporting local teams in selected areas to do unarmed civilian protection in the coming months. So right now, I'm living in a paradox. As I say all of this, I think we'll never have enough. There's just too much. It's too overwhelming. And at the same time, I know deep inside of me that we have everything we need to create a culture of peace and nonviolence in the here and now. We have everything we need. One of those resources that we need is Rosemary Kabaki, who has come and has been working with us in Minneapolis for the last 2 months. And it's been a real pleasure to work with both Rosemary and Jessica. So Rosemary, please.
Thanks, Mel. And just to warm us up and get Rosemary started, Rosemary, can I ask you a question and get you to say, how do you see the work of NP really concretely opening space for dialogue and helping people to reimagine or rethink public and community safety based on the assessment and the training work you've been doing now?
Thank you very much, Tiffany and Mel. It's been a fascinating time in the US, particularly because I have worked in a few other countries that are also trying to reimagine what security means for them. And it has been fascinating. And if I may build up on what Mel just talked about, for me, I see these linkages that NP is starting to create as the genesis of a way that we can take these resources that are within us. So for example, we initially started by having a conversation on schools and how we can be part of the training of the replacement of the police. I've been fascinated to then see, coming from that, that we have engaged with a group of people who are wanting to do gang diversion and giving the same training, so that that training that happens in the schools on unarmed civilian protection and how to reimagine security for the youth in school continues outside the school, where these same students live. When they have left the school environment, they go outside and they find amongst themselves their peers who also are wanting to engage and reimagine what security is. Again, I'm fascinated to see, as Mel says, we have some security guards also asking the same questions. So I have this image of this youth coming from school and having an understanding of security that is different from direct response to an incident of violence, but what can you do before, during, and after? And they go into their neighborhoods and find similar conversations going on, coming from a different perspective from this group of interrupters of violence in the communities. And the security guards they meet as they walk around in the malls also will have undergone the similar training. And I find this opens up a way for the community to start building the linkages that Tiffany, you talked about some of the indicators that maybe one of the things that we need to reimagine how our relationships are and how we have collective responsibility about security for ourselves. And the most fascinating thing for me is also meeting maybe some church leaders who also are asking the same questions. And fascinatingly enough, when we asked the youth yesterday, actually, what would you like to start building the bridges with? That's what they talked about. They said we would like to go to elementary school and start talking with the children there. We are peacekeepers now, and share with them some of these aspects that we've learned. And then even more fascinating, we will use the churches in our communities because there's distrust between the elder members of our community and the youth who tend to be perceived as violence instigators. And now we want to change that conversation. We want to introduce them to youth that are starting to have conversations on how to address differently. So how are we doing? As Mel says, it is an experiment. But we are very lucky that it is an experiment where we have all the materials in the community. Already we have found so many people willing and able and committed to engage this. And the methods that we are teaching them give them tools that they can use beyond what they already have. They can add on to it, they can adapt it in their context. And in this context, I really see a role for this work to happen over a period of time. I think time is a challenge. Wherever I have worked, it has sometimes taken 3 months, 6 months, a year. But violence isn't going away in our communities until we do something about it, until we contribute to changing this discussion. So this is what I feel right now after only 8 weeks in the US, but so many indicators that it is an experiment that has a lot of support, that with so many people with great heart and great vision on how they would like to see peace in their security, in their communities.
Great. Thanks so much, Rosemary. And I think that point around time is really important. These are long engagements. There can be short, quick interventions, but really changing attitudes, changing behaviors, as we see, this is true everywhere. It just takes a really long time to really heal and to build new ways of thinking. So thanks for reminding us about that. And Jessica, would love to hear from you. As you heard in the introduction, Jessica really understands security. She was our safety and security advisor in Iraq and South Sudan. So she's been on the front lines of a lot of tough locations and really understands what it means to work with armed actors and how to keep people safe. And so great to have you there. And Jessica, I think people are always really curious about sort of concretely what do we mean when we're talking about this. Could you talk a bit sort of concretely about how you think this will work in the school, specifically in the school setting?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Tiffany, and hello, everybody. I'm just so excited to talk about this. To set the stage a little bit, let me describe a little bit about what's happened. So I know that many of you are across the United States and international as well. Traditionally, here in Minneapolis, there have been law enforcement officers, even at times armed law enforcement officers, placed in the public high schools around the city. And in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, and as nationally and here in the Twin Cities, we are reimagining what safety and security actually means, and what community police, and what policing means and policing reform means. The Minneapolis Public School District decided to not renew their contract with the Minneapolis Police Department, and instead is looking for unarmed, nonviolent alternatives to traditional law enforcement in schools, focusing more on de-escalation rather than escalating the problems. So the very first thing that we did when approached by this was reach out to the students. They know their context best. And so we worked with them to understand what were their needs. What did they see? What did they feel like could help them and benefit them and interrupt cycles of violence that were happening in the schools? And oh man, we had so many amazing conversations with them. We really did. And they shared some very, very personal experiences about what types of violence they were seeing on the day-to-day and what would happen when that violence did occur in schools. And you know what? It was with the model of the school resource officer, which is the Minneapolis Police Department officer in the school, we found that the action was always punitive. Always punitive. And in fact, it focused more on the suspension or the expulsion or the removal of that individual rather than how did we get to that place of violence in the first place? You know, how could we have perhaps prevented that violence? How could we have interrupted it? And so what we're hoping to achieve in the schools is train these new safety support specialists that are being brought on by the school district using UCP methodologies to understand how could they prevent some of that violence. And a lot of that is relationship building with the students, with the school administrators, with the faculty, engagement with outside resources to provide more specialized support for students who are perhaps in need of it or struggling, to work with community outreach workers who have an understanding of the context that's going on in the community. As we know, just because an individual is struggling at school, that doesn't mean that they leave school and their struggle is over. You know, we need to think about the entire context as a whole and how we can mitigate some of those problems. So for us, we really want to help them focus on the relationship building with the students, identifying some of those early warning indicators, interrupting that violence, and then creating a sustainable approach to bring those students back in, and not to cast people off, not to be punitive, but to create a sustainable solution and to keep them involved in their community and to really, really, really promote the primacy of the local actor, which are the students, which is one of our principles, and learn from them. And we don't pretend to have all the answers, and we need their input to really build out these methodologies. So that's what we're looking for. We're looking to interrupt the violence, de-escalate the violence if and when it does occur, and then build out a sustainable program for them after it's been interrupted. Yeah.
Great, thanks so much, Jess. And you're talking about the schools is it's a reminder to me of another indicator that is this normalization of violence, normalization of interpersonal violence. And if we think about the schools, normalizing the fact that there has to be armed security forces inside the school, I thought you said traditionally, and that's contemporarily, traditionally, but many of us remember when we were children, we didn't need armed actors in our schools, but somehow that has happened, and it's become normalized, that has become, it's expected in the norm, and that is also a very strong indicator of a very high level acceptance of violence, which is also really worrying for indicators of potential widespread actions. Well, great. Well, thanks everybody. That's a little bit of a taster. So as you can see, there's a lot of different ways, directions that we could be going. There's a lot of need for this kind of work. We're trying to really think about what's the best way we can make a meaningful contribution in this area. NP, typically, we don't like to do a one-off training. It's great and it's helpful and it raises awareness, but we really like to get involved with groups who really want to commit to, building skills, building capacity, and then really getting involved in implementing this kind of work. So that's what my colleagues there have been describing, sort of the way that they've been looking at the approach and things that we could do to replicate in other parts of the US, wherever it might be useful. And while we're just reflecting on these things, if you have questions for any of the group, please let us know. Just go ahead and write them there in the chat window, and I'd be happy to read them out as they come up. To get us warmed up, I've got a question that we got in advance from John Brewer. Thanks, John, to get us warmed up. So I will read it out, and Mel, Rosemary, and Jess, let's see which one of you might want to take this one on. Is any locality in the US, whether a single block neighborhood in a city or a small town, actually implementing some form of UCP in lieu of armed policing? Last June, the Seattle Autonomous Zone, which did not seem to be planned, ended in less than a month with the deaths of several residents. I know the CV neighborhoods attempts to reduce violence on the police, but is anyone trying to live without armed police, at least for a while? So we send that back to you. Mel, I suspect you're probably best positioned to answer that question.
Okay. First of all, hi, John. To our knowledge, other than the Seattle example, there are no larger municipalities or neighborhoods that are disavowing police and only using UCP. There are communities that have grown up well in advance of now that are using unarmed approaches to provide safety and security. These are usually intentional communities. More what we're seeing is that people want to use UCP as a method to protect their community and to use to avoid calling police. Because once the situation escalates to the point of calling police, bad things happen often, especially if you're a person of color. And so, for example, the community group and the union, which is primarily Black and Brown led, are saying, we want our people to be trained in how to intervene so that the police never are called. And so it's more not a total disavowal of the police, but recognizing that we can do much more in advance before they're ever called upon.
Cool. Another question coming up here from Judy Timmons is, have we thought about using restorative justice practices as part of UCP? Mel, I see you nodding there. Why don't you jump in?
I love this. Thanks for the question. Restorative justice circles are complementing our work. These are also being used in the Minneapolis public schools and will be a complement to the unarmed civilian protection. And as Jess referred to, the tools that these safety and security specialists will have, one of them will be to work with the restorative circles that are in the schools. And I'm happy to say that those are developing and have been developed in both Minneapolis and in St. Paul.
I see a couple of questions and maybe some folks joining in later, and I apologize, we do tend to slip into our own acronyms. If you're wondering, UCP stands for Unarmed Civilian Protection. It's the methodology or the toolkit that Nonviolent Peaceforce uses in our work in violence reduction and civilian protection. Ellen Mitty is asking, has NPA been able to access any public monies under the CARES or other COVID-19 funds that might be available? Martin, yeah, go ahead, Mel.
Yeah, Marna, go ahead.
We have accessed the payroll protection program funds, and we're able to ensure that we can keep all of our staff on. That's the only aspect of the CARES Act that we have been able to access, though. But it was a huge help. Thanks.
Great. Interesting question here from Jim Hart. What's the smallest geographical political area that makes sense in which to organize a UCP approach? Rosemary or Jess, do you guys want to take that one?
Yeah, I think everywhere we go, we don't look at it geographically. I think we pay attention to the relationships that we can build and how many partners we can be bringing together and the resources we need to put in place to go to support the communities. Our focus a lot is on who is vulnerable. So they could be occupying a very small geographic area or a large geographic area. But as Jess was talking about the primacy of actors, where are they? Where are the vulnerable communities and how can we reach out to them? So we have had some programming that maybe just looks at protecting human rights defenders who may be one individual or two individuals. Or we could be talking about giving skills to a whole group of women peace teams, for example, that geographically cover a whole range of areas in, for example, in South Sudan. And now in Burma, we are talking about 3 states in Myanmar where the women are working in. So our focus is based on who can we work with to increase protection.
Exactly. We can work with really small groups over very large geographic areas. It's quite flexible.
And if I could add
Chris?
one thing to that, Jim, yesterday when we were working with the young men in the Emerge program, as part of that program, they do food distribution. And that's like in one part of one block. But there are conflicts and violence that break out there, as we've seen in other areas of the world where we work. And so working with those young men of how to intervene and de-escalate when conflicts break out in that very, very small area in North Minneapolis.
And a very, very timely question from Hugh Gulch. Does NP have plans to have a presence at polling stations during the elections? Or what about afterwards, hotspots? And have we been invited to do that kind of work, to be anywhere such as in Seattle or Portland?
We have been invited in Minneapolis. We're working with the Service Employees Union and community groups and the young men in Emerge to try to see what we can put together, because the Republican Party is recruiting up to 50,000 volunteers to disrupt polls. And so we're working on that. At the same time, we have been providing training to selected cities, 10 hours of online training of how to do this kind of work, which can include protection at the polls. This is going to be vitally needed in a matter of weeks.
Stefan is asking about possibility for weapons-free zones. There's so many weapons in the US. Weapons-free zones is a tactic that we use in other places that we work. What do we think about that as a possibility in some areas in the US?
That's a lot to unpack, for sure. In the US. Of course, we would very much be open to exploring that much more. It would take a lot of conversations and a lot more meetings like the one we're having now to understand what that might look like from a policy perspective and what our limitations might be. But it's absolutely something that we would love to explore more.
I think what has been interesting in this kind of conversations is that people are having these conversations. And I think the recognition that a lot needs to be done once the intention has been put in place. What needs to be put in place, not only for the community that may want a weapons-free zone, but what else needs to be put in place to support that structure. I think it has been conversations we've had in other parts of the world. Who else needs to be part of that so that that becomes a reality and does not necessarily increase the vulnerability of the people who have opted to have an weapons-free zone.
Yeah, the real main thing that makes weapons-free zones successful is that they are the choice of the people living in that area, in the community, and it's driven that it's a mutual commitment to do the work that it takes to put that in place. I'm noticing a number of comments sort of really identifying different, like the US is really different than South Sudan or Iraq, for example, and vice versa. And how does that impact how we're thinking about things? Does anybody want to respond to sort of that general thought that we're seeing in a few comments and questions?
Yeah. When we go to a new country, I remember going off to Burma, and the first thing I remember hearing a lot from the communities is, you're giving us examples about Philippines. We are so different. You're talking about work that you're doing in South Sudan that has nothing to do with what we're doing. And it is an important conversation to have, because that's the conversation on what do you have that is of concern to you in terms of civilian protection. Maybe not like South Sudan, maybe not like Philippines, yes, definitely not like Burma, but what are your concerns? And the beauty about unarmed civilian protection is that based on those concerns, then we can see what's gonna work in your context and not generically. And we try and get into really specific areas, not the whole of Minnesota, not the whole of Twin Cities, but as Mel was talking about, in your block, when you're young, are you young and maybe Black? What does that make sense to you? Are you in your 80s and maybe a white pastor? What does that make sense to you? Where is your security? How personal is it? We do get down to those very important specifics. We have found it challenging sometimes talking about this happened in South Sudan, and it does take time for people to start understanding. We are trying to focus more on these methods to work. And maybe they've worked in DC and they've worked in Little Rock, and then people then start identifying that. But the main thing is, what are the violence that you're concerned about, and what methods do you think can work? And people come up with methods that mirror what we call unarmed civilian protection.
I just say one thing. On the 22nd of October, we will be having another cafe. It's going to be an hour and a half long. And because we're going to have it facilitated, and the focus is going to be on what makes you feel safe in your community. How can you increase safety in your community? What are actions you can take? So watch for more information on that and the email invitation.
Yeah. And if I can pick up on that last question, and I see Linda, Linda's challenge and question. And Linda was one of the original 13 unarmed civilian protectors who 20 years ago went to Sri Lanka. You know, when I found in June, meeting with people and talking with people about what we did, often would get kind of a, we're not as bad as Iraq, or we're not like South Sudan. And that's right. But as we talk about specific incidences of violence that people encounter, there's a lot of similarities. And we found, like yesterday in the training, the methods that we were training on were de-escalation, accompaniment, and proactive presence. And with very specific applications to North Minneapolis. And that in one way, sure, you can say it's different, the context is different, the culture is different, the various combatants are different, there are all kinds of differences. And there are some basic incidences of violence that we find that are pretty common.
Thanks, Will. We've got so many questions. We're not going to get to all of them, I'm afraid. I'm trying to group them in lots of you have asked about how to get involved, how to get training. I see you. Just hold on a sec. We'll do that right at the end. And there's quite a number of questions about scaling up. What are there plans to scale up? What would it take to scale up? How many people do we need? Do we have quick response to that?
I think we definitely have to scale up. And I'll be unabashed. The first thing we need is money. You know, and to do that kind of scale up would require significant money. Secondly, I think that it's important that we recognize that there are existing organizations that are widespread that are interested in doing this. And so I wouldn't see scaling up necessarily as having a large nonviolent peace force deployment. Maybe there would be some of us, but more importantly, there would be neighborhood groups. Rose was asking about church groups and unions and youth groups who can all pick up a part of this. we have to much more, I think, inculcate this work into existing organizations if we're going to get to the scale that we need to be in this country.
And I think to add on to that question of what more we need, I think we've spent quite a bit of time doing a lot of Zoom introduction to unarmed civilian protection, 5 hours, sometimes 10 hours, sometimes, 6 hours face-to-face as we did with the youth groups. And a lot of it, and Tiffany made a reference to this, the work we do is beyond just giving awareness and beyond just training. I think there's a place for Nonviolent Peaceforce to continue helping, mentoring and coaching and having these conversations on an ongoing basis, or as things change, as they become dynamic, as they, we're talking about watching the Black Lives Matter campaign now and seeing the different phases that it's going through, and therefore the protection around that also changes, and civilian protection role changes over time. More people get involved. How to involve the group that we're in with now, they're asking us, how do we bring in other people on board? And some of the concern is that we could spend a lot of time helping people to bring people on board and not paying attention to what they're coming on board to do, so that we need to spend time on the protection itself.
Great. Okay, we're going to do one more question. We have, let's see, from Gloria, who's making a nice comment about really the importance of facing history and interrupting cycles of violence and hatred. I'm wondering if we're utilizing healing community police dialogues to transform the disease while addressing the symptoms.
I think maybe even the schools are a little bit easier because they've already moved a little bit further for me to answer that question. It was interesting working with the youth for them to identify what resources there are within the communities that are already really good at doing that, and how are they linked to the structure of protection for them. So it was fascinating, they would talk about maybe sexual-based violence happening in and out of schools. And some of the support they could get is outside the school environment, because there's some wonderful programs. So then the key issue is, how do we link that support to be available into the schools? So we do work a lot with other people that really make wonderful interventions. And we don't necessarily need to get involved in it, but boy, do we need to link everybody as much as possible. And we asked the students themselves, and they knew, oh yeah, these people would help. We trust them, we believe in them, they can do it. And if I was ever in a situation where there was sexually gender-based violence, I would be very comfortable working with them, and I think they'll do a good job. So that's just kind of one example on how students already identify, this is how we can get help, and how we make security and protection a broader conversation. Other people get involved, and this is good.
And an example of those community resources. And I think that is really our role, is to help to create the space for protection and prevention of violence, so that those other resources can work and be more effective. So yesterday in the training we were doing with the young men, one of the scenarios was on a city bus and a disruption, and where an old man was being hassled by some younger men, and it was starting to get violent. And some of the other young men came to intervene. This was all in a role play. And they had worked out their own approaches at this point. This was like the last part of the training. The young men who intervened ended up recruiting the young men who were doing the hassling and about to become violent, recruiting them to come and be in their program. And so using that community resource to show them that there's something else to do. And it also, to me, showed a great pride in the community resource, that they would use that as a de-escalation method.
All right, we're just getting warmed up and we're running out of time, which is a great sign. There's been some questions about, as I said, about how to get involved. One sort of a question that's been, can people who are not from the US become involved? Could they come and help? Which I think is a great question, and really challenges us all to see that as a global community, we need to help each other. We've got Rosemary there, who's come. She's Kenyan, was living in Myanmar, and is there, and I think that there's certainly space for that. But really concretely, if somebody wants to contact NP to seek training or see if they can volunteer or get involved, Mel, how would, in the US, what's the best way to do that?
They should email info@nonviolentpeaceforce.org.
Put that in the chat.
Claire will put it in the chat. Yep.
Great. So info@nonviolentpeaceforce.org, and let us know who you are and what you need, and we'll see what we can do. That sounds great. All right. Thanks everybody for this those great questions. I want to just take a little minute to introduce one more speaker. Longtime supporter Nevin Harwood. He's a volunteer and a really good friend to Nonviolent Peaceforce. Last year he had the chance, created the opportunity to go to Myanmar to see our work firsthand, the impact of what UCP work can do in a different location. So Nevin, I just invite you to come in and join us and speak. And thank you very much for being willing to share your thoughts and closing up this meeting today. Just needs to be unmuted. More complicated than it looks.
Thank you, Tiffany. It's great to be here, and I will say, as I'm listening today, that I never stop learning every time I'm with somebody from NP or in one of these cafes. It just sometimes just overwhelms me. Going to Myanmar was a privilege to spend time with Rosemary, get to know her, and spend a little extra time with her as my flights got canceled with COVID starting, and got to know people in the office over there. And everybody I've met, whether it's in Myanmar or Tiffany, who I've only known through Zoom, these are hardworking people, underpaid, overworked, and doing things that are heroic. My interest in nonviolence was simple, just in history class in high school, but wondering how Gandhi could really apply this. And then in college, I graduated in 1968, and so I was lived through some of the Martin Luther King Jr. How do I describe it? Well, I can't even describe it, but different horrific times in the United States. And then I met Mel Duncan. Well, lived through the Vietnam War conflict. Then I met Mel Duncan, who started to teach me how nonviolence really works. And so I went from a student listening to a real student of Mel's, and I have learned that it really works. I've learned through the folks, especially in South Sudan and then in Myanmar, who've made it work on the ground. Mel started this meeting by, and I believe what he said, that we have something to the effect, we have everything we need to create peace in the here and now. And I really believe that's true. I believe it now more than ever. However, as we go, and I say we as a volunteer, as we develop these new programs and people are coming to NP, NP is not going out looking for ways to spend your money, but as people come to NP, and for our NP to undertake these new programs, it takes money. So I have the privilege of reminding you, if you are a prior donor of NP, to please, please, please continue with your donations. And if you are new to that opportunity, please consider making a donation of any amount you can. It's very simple. Marna Anderson is on this Zoom, but the website, nonviolentpeaceforce.org, is a great website. It makes donating very easy. PayPal, whatever you have. So please consider that. And I'm going to stop here because this time can be used in other ways. So back to you, Tiffany.
Great, thank you so much, Nevin. And I just wanted to wrap it up. Thank everybody from the team they are exhausted. They've been working around the clock. So thanks you guys for making time for this, for sharing with everybody here, and keep that great work up. Thanks for everybody for participating. Your interest, your encouragement is motivating and inspiring for everybody. And as I said at the top, these are complex problems. It takes more than one single solution. So we all need to work at it from the angles that we can. We all make the contributions that we can and move forward. In the chat box, if you want more information, if you want to continue the conversation with anybody, make sure you reach out at info@nonviolentpeaceforce.org. We're on all the social media platforms. You can find us there. And we will see you at the next cafe.
October 22nd.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. So wonderful to see you. Really,
Thanks
really
so
love that.
much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.